Hey everyone, in this video we're looking at power and conflict poetry, focusing specifically on the poem Émigrée, which was written by Carol Rumens. So the context of this poem is that it was written by Carol Rumens, who's a British poet. The poem was published in 1993 and it explores the universal experience of exile and the way memory can idealize a lost home. Unlike many war poems that focus on the battlefield, this poem focuses on the psychological impact of being forced to leave one's country due to tyranny or war. The plot of this poem is as follows. So the speaker describes a city she left as a child. Although her old home is now sick with tyrants and broken by war, her memory of it remains sunlight clear. She carries this idealized version of the city with her like a doll. Even as people in her new home treat her as an outsider and mutter death, she remains loyal to her bright, filled paperweight of a memory. The main message of the poem is that memory is a powerful form of resistance. The city of walls and the tyrants cannot destroy the speaker's internal sense of identity. The poem suggests that our emotional reality is often stronger than physical reality of war or displacement, but it also hints at the pain of living in a no man's land where you belong to a place that no longer exists. Key symbolism in the poem is that sunlight is the most important recurring symbol, which represents the speaker's unwavering positive memory of home. The paperweight represents the heavy, solid, and preserved nature of that memory, and the city is personified as a lover of a pet. Comes to me, comes as her are key quotes in the poem, showing her deep, intimate attachment to her origins. Key ideas in the poem are as follows. So we have the idea of memory versus reality. The speaker is under siege by the tyrants who have taken her city, but her memory of it is sunlight clear. This proves that internal identity or spirit is stronger than political power, reducing the terrifying news of war to something that cannot stain her vision. It looks at the psychological toll of exile. So the real enemy is absence and the state at bay. Her power is limited because she is branded by an impression of sunlight, suggesting that her love for her home makes her an eternal outsider in her new country. It looks at the inadequacy of borders. So the speaker believes that her city comes to me in its own white plane, showing that borders are useless against the mind. However, the irony exposes the ruler's foolishness. So while the tyrants control the land, they can never control the luminous city the speaker carries within her. It looks at the cycle of conflict. So the poem's repetitive use of sunlight at the end of every stanza suggests an endless static state of longing. It highlights that war is a slow psychological erosion that leaves the victim dancing in the shadow of a place they can never return to. Let's have a look at the structure of the poem. So it's written in three stanzas of nearly equal length, and the regular structure reflects the speaker's attempt to impose order and stability on her fragmented life. It suggests a controlled, deliberate act of remembering. It looks at a lack of a fixed rhyme with enjambment, and it's similar to tissue as the use of free verse and enjambment creates a natural flowing tone. This reflects the fluid nature of memory and how her thoughts leak across the boundaries of time and space. It looks at the refrain of sunlight. So every stanza concludes with the word sunlight. This emphasizes the irony that exposes the ruler's foolishness. So despite the darkness of the tyranny, her vision remains bright and undefeated. It looks at caesura and breaking points. So the frequent use of full stops and breaks, for example, it may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I am branded, mimics the fractured nature of exile and the way her memory is broken into specific vivid spots of time. Let's have a look at the context of the poem then. So, the context is the experience of exile. So, Rumens, who's the poet, explores the pity of displacement. Just as Owen focused on the physical misery of the trenches, Rumens focuses on the psychological misery of being an outsider. It highlights the pity of losing one's home to tyrants and the struggle to maintain identity in a new, often hostile, dark environment. It looks at universal conflict. So, the city is never named, though it could represent places like Beirut, Sarajevo, or modern day Damascus. This suggests that the darkness of tyranny is universal. By keeping the city anonymous, Rumens critiques the way conflict stains our origins, suggesting that the human spirit must trace its own map of home through memory. It looks at memory as resistance, so the sunlight in the poem acts as a symbol of truth and hope, much like the light in tissue. It proves that pride leads to downfall for tyrants, as they can control this physical land but never control the speaker's luminous and bright mental image of her city. It also looks at the theme of the other and exclusion. So it's written during a time of increased global migration, and the poem acts as a critique of how refugees are treated. It exposes the darkness of xenophobia, which is the muttering of the new city, urging the reader to see the living tissue of the person behind the paperweight of their past. Let's have a look at the actual poem Émigrée then. So here is the poem. You're more than welcome to pause the video and have a little read, and when you're done, press play so we can go through it again. Let's do a line-by-line analysis. So the first quote says, there once was a country, I left it as a child. The method here is ellipsis and a fairy tale opening, there was once. And the analysis is that the ellipsis creates a sense of longing and distance. The once was makes it sound like a legend, suggesting the country as she knew it no longer exists. But my memory of it is sunlight clear is an example of a compound adjective and light imagery, and sunlight is a dominant motif, as it represents an untainted, perfect memory which refuses to be darkened by the reality of war or tyrants. For it seems I never saw it in that November, which I am told comes to the mildest city, is a metaphor, which is November here, and the parenthesis, which is the brackets. And the November here represents gloom, cold, and conflict, and the speaker refuses to acknowledge the darkness of her home, choosing instead to blockade her mind against the bad news she is told. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view, the bright filled paperweight. And this is a metaphor here, as her memory is a paperweight, it is heavy, solid, and holds her identity in place. Even the worst news cannot shift the luminous image she carries. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I am branded by an impression of sunlight. It's an example of personification, and the verb choice branded is very important here. As the city is sick, implying war is a corruption. Branded suggests a permanent, painful mark, but it is one of sunlight, proving her love for her home is an inescapable part of her soul. The white streets of that city, the graceful slopes, glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks, is an example of contrast and personification, and the graceful slopes are juxtaposed with the tanks of war. So as time passes, her memory doesn't fade, it glows, proving that the human spirit is stronger than the monolith of military power. And the frontiers rise between us, close like waves, is a simile and natural imagery here, as borders are compared to waves, suggesting they are a natural, overwhelming barrier. It highlights the pity of exile, where the doors are closed to her return. That child's vocabulary I carried here, like a hollow doll, opens and spills a grammar, is a simile and toy imagery as well. So her original language as a hollow doll, something precious but perhaps fragile or empty without a home to speak in it. It spills, suggesting her culture is an irrepressible force. Soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it is an example of a scientific metaphor using the word molecule, and it suggests a microscopic, obsessive level of detail. She's reconstructing her home molecule by molecule in her mind to replace the blank desertion of her current reality. It may by now be a lie, banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. It tastes of sunlight. Is an example of a gustatory imagery, which is to do with taste as well as sibilance. And basically here, her identity is banned, yet she cannot stop being who she is. The S sounds in tastes of sunlight create a soft, lingering feel, proving her culture is more nourishing than the state. I have no passport, there's no way back at all, but my city comes to me in its own white plane, is an example of paradox as well as personification, and this shows that physically she is trapped with no passport, but mentally she's free. The city comes to me, suggesting her memory is an active, living thing which defies borders. It lies down in front of me, docile as paper. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes, shows a simile as well as animalistic personification. And here she treats her memory like a pet or a child. It is docile, suggesting she has total control over her idealized version of home, even if she has no control over the real one. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. They accuse me of absence. They circle me. Shows a juxtaposition as well as ambiguous pronoun with the word they. And what it shows here is that she exists in two places at once. They, who refers to the people in her new home, see her as a threat or a ghost. The walls suggest she is imprisoned by her exile and the muttering of the locals. They mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight, as an example of contrast or symbolic conclusions. And here the muttering represents the darkness of xenophobia. However, her shadow, which is her physical presence, is only possible because of the sunlight, which is her origin. It proves that irony exposes the ruler's foolishness. They can hate her, but they cannot erase the bright reality of where she came from. Let's do a section by section analysis then. So, lines 1 to 8 show us a memory of sunlight, and what happens is the speaker introduces her memory of a lost country. Although she left as a child and is told the city is now sick with tyrants, she refuses to let the worst news change her idealized, sunlight clear vision of home. The effect of this is that this establishes the city not as a geographical place but as a bright, filled paperweight in her mind. It suggests that internal identity is a form of resistance. The darkness of war cannot penetrate the luminous nature of her memories, and it proves that the human spirit is stronger than the tyrants who currently occupy the land. The main techniques here are the compound adjective, the metaphor, and the personification. Lines 9 to 16 show the vocabulary of exile, and what happens is the speaker describes how her memory grows even clearer despite the passage of time and the arrival of tanks. She discusses her child's vocabulary, which she carries with her like a hollow doll, preserving her native tongue even though it is banned by the state. The effect of this is that this section explores the psychological toll of exile. The frontiers rising like waves represent the blockade between her past and present, and by clinging to her grammar, she refuses to let her identity be shoveled away by her new environment. It highlights the pity of a culture that exists only in the taste of the speaker. The main techniques here are contrast, simile, and gustatory imagery. Lines 17 to 25 demonstrate the confrontation with reality, and what happens is the speaker acknowledges she has no passport and cannot return. She personifies her city as a living thing that visits her and takes her dancing. Finally, she confronts the they of her new city, who mutter death at her while she stands her ground. The effect of this is that this is a climax where the two cities collide, the luminous city of her mind and the city of walls where she now lives. The muttering represents the darkness of xenophobia, and the final image of her shadow falling as evidence of sunlight confirms that her existence is a triumph. Her very presence proves the bright reality of her origins still exist. The main techniques here are personification, ambiguous pronoun in they, and the symbolic contrast. Let's look at the overall interpretation. So, Carol Ruman's The Émigrée explores a profound disconnect between the physical destruction of a homeland and the luminous preserved reality of a survivor's memory. Through a structured yet fluid form and the recurring motif of sunlight, the poem depicts the speaker's past as a bright, filled paperweight, a humbled yet resilient mental construct that remains transparent to her despite the merciless tyranny that has branded her city. The poem suggests that exile leaves an indelible mark of belonging on the human soul, transforming the sick reality of a war-torn country into a luminous internal landscape that no longer offers physical shelter but provides spiritual certainty. By the end, the realization that her shadow falls as evidence of sunlight reveals a bitter truth that political power is temporary and the pride of tyrants leads to a downfall of the spirit, as they can conquer the land but never the living tissue of a person's heritage. The blank hostility of her new environment confirms that memory identity is stronger than humans, leaving the witness in a state of permanent, sunlight-clear realization. The irony exposes the ruler's foolishness, showing that the glory of state control is a lie that ends in the indestructible, shining truth of an individual's past. Let's look at a comparison checklist if we use this poem in our essays. So we must look at the internal fortress. So unlike the monoliths of brick and tissue, the speaker in the Émigrée builds a fortress out of sunlight. Both poems suggest that the only structure that lasts is the one held within living tissue. They look at nature as the ultimate truth. So in tissue, daylight breaks through buildings, but in the Émigrée, sunlight brands the speaker. Both poets use light to prove that nature and time is stronger than humans, specifically stronger than tyrants or capitals. We also look at the fragility of borders. So the maps in tissue that sun shines through mirror the frontiers in the Émigrée that close like waves. Both show that man-made divisions are futile against the drift of the humankind. They also look at language as identity. So just as the Quran records histories in tissue, the speaker's child's vocabulary in the Émigrée spills of grammar. Both poems argue that our culture and spirit is more monumental than any physical brick or block. It also looks at a temporary tyrant. So both poems conclude that pride leads to downfall. Whether it is a monolith of stone or a city sick with tyrants, both are eventually reduced to shadows when compared to the enduring lights of human reality. Let's look at what poems we can compare with the Émigrée. So we can compare the Émigrée with Kamikaze. Similarities are the fragility of human ego. Both poems explore how political or military pride destroy individuals' lives. So in the Émigrée, the tyrants seize the city and exile the speaker, but in Kamikaze, the state's cold command for a suicide mission destroys a family's bond, proving that the state pride leads to a downfall of personal happiness. It looks at the dominance of nature or memory. So both poems use nature to show that the human spirit cannot be fully controlled by the state. In the Émigrée, the sunlight of memory is stronger than the tanks, but in Kamikaze, the silver of the fish and the pearl grey pebbles remind the pilot of the beauty of life, causing him to abandon his suicide mission. It looks at the use of irony. So irony exposes the ruler's foolishness in both poems. The tyrants in the Émigrée ban a city that survives in the speaker's mind, just as the glory of the kamikaze mission in Garland's poem leads only to a silent social death where the pilot is treated like a ghost. Differences between the poems are as follows. So it looks at the internal versus external exile. In the Émigrée, the speaker is a physical exile from her home, longing to return. But in Kamikaze, the pilot is an internal exile. He returns home but is banned and ignored by his own family, making his isolation perhaps more shriveled and painful. It looks at light versus dark tones. So the Émigrée is saturated with sunlight and luminous imagery, suggesting a hopeful, defiant resilience. Kamikaze ends in a dark, melancholic tone, wondering which death, the physical mission or the social silence, would have been the better way to die. It also looks at voice versus silence. So Rumens gives her speaker a strong first-person voice, I am branded, and Garland uses a third-person narrative through the daughter's voice, emphasizing the pilot's total loss of agency because he is spoken for but never speaks for himself. We can also compare the Émigrée with Poppies. So similarities are the power of domestic memory, as both poems use small, tactile objects to represent massive loss. In the Émigrée, memory is a bright filled paperweight, but in Poppies it is cat hairs and sellotape. Both suggest that the pity of war is felt most sharply in the living tissue of home life. The similarity is the conflict of childhood, so both poets link war to a loss of innocence. Rumens left her city as a child, and Weir's mother remembers her son as a child with a playground voice. Both show how the glory of conflict destroys the innocent hope of the family unit. They also look at sense resistance, so both speakers use their senses to fight against the blank reality of loss. The Émigrée tastes sunlight, and the mother in Poppies traces the inscriptions on the memorial. This proves that human touch and memory are a blockade against the coldness of the state. Differences between Poppies and Émigrée are the direction of loss. So the Émigrée is about a child losing her place, which is the city. Poppies is about a parent losing her son, which is the sun. And this changes degree from a longing for where you belong to a longing for who you belong to. The static versus active journey shows that the Émigrée feels static, as the speaker is struck in a city of walls. Remembering Poppies involves an active pilgrimage to the war memorial on the top of the hill, reflecting a more physical process of mourning. It looks at the ending, so the Émigrée ends on a defiant visual image of sunlight. Poppies ends on an auditory note of hoping to hear a voice, leaving the conclusion more fragile and unresolved. Let's look at key quotes to revise for this poem. So we have a few key quotes here. We have the bright filled paperweight, which is a metaphor suggesting her memory is a solid, heavy, and stable force that holds her identity in place. Unlike the drift of her life in exile, this mental monument is indestructible, proving that internal identity is more permanent than political tanks. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I am branded by an impression of sunlight, shows personification and a metaphor. War is depicted as a corruption or sickness, and the verb branded suggests a permanent painful mark of ownership, but it is one of sunlight and hope, proving that her spirit is irreversibly linked to her origins, despite the shriveled state of the land. The frontiers rise between us, close like waves, is a simile and natural imagery, showing that borders are as fluid, powerful, and overwhelming as the ocean. It highlights the pity of exile when nature and time creates a blockade that makes the doors close to her return. That child's vocabulary I carried here, like a hollow doll, opens and spills a grammar, is an example of simile and personification. Her original language is presented as a fragile, precious toy. It emphasizes the psychological toll of exile. Although her culture is shoveled away by her new environment, it remains a living tissue that she refuses to let die. They mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight, is personification and contrast. So the muttering represents the darkness of xenophobia and hostility. However, her shadow, which is reality, can only exist because of the sunlight, which is her origin, and it proves that irony exposes the ruler's foolishness. They can threaten her with death, but they cannot erase the bright evidence of her identity.